Thank you so much. I want to thank Armin for hosting this wonderful series. They've been really interesting to attend. And I also want to thank everybody who has come to participate or will listen to this recording later. You can reach me at the University of Michigan at the email displayed here. Should you have any questions now or later, especially if you're listening to the recording at a later time. As a quick introduction, I'm an educational cognitive neuroscientist. My primary line of inquiry is bilingual language development. I study how children learn to speak, read, and think in multiple languages and along multiple cultural dimensions. At the same time, we'll look at broader questions such as learning, literacy, math, and attention development. We'll look at children who have experienced difficulties in their learning trajectories, especially in language and reading, such as children with language development and dyslexia. And we use a variety of neuroimaging methods, including optical brain imaging, magnetic resonance, and others. The focus of our laboratory is indeed on the optical brain imaging. And today we will focus on the bilingual reading. While do so, the world is multilingual, as many of you attending this talk likely know. We speak all sorts of languages. If we look at European Union, most individuals who identify themselves as multilingual than monolingual speakers. If we talk to our colleagues and friends in India, they will ask you, what is a bilingual? A lot of them speak more than two languages, pardon me. It would be relatively unusual for them to speak just one. It's two and then more. Similarly, in the United States, we encounter a multitude of languages. So everywhere you turn, the world is multilingual. However, if we look back at our scientific research and you go on something as refutable as PubMed and you type in some simple words, child, brain, reading, development, we're going to discover as a healthy number of research articles published on the topic. And if you add the word dyslexia, the number increases dramatically. However, whenever you're going to add the word bilingual to these counts, these are the numbers underneath, you will see disproportionately less. So we had just discussed that most of the world speaks multiple languages, not just even two, but more than two languages. At the same time, the way we're doing our work in our research institutions is mostly focused on unilingual learners, whereas our understanding of the multilingual world and how the folks speak and how they read is disproportionately less in relation to the population that actually speaks multiple languages. So this is the gap we're trying to fill through a series of research projects that we're conducting with colleagues, Fumiko Heft and Dr. Yuchi Kochi in San Francisco, University of Connecticut, as well as individuals at the University of Michigan, Dr. Satterfield and Twyla Tardif, James Booth at Vanderbilt, and a colleague, Dr. Tai-Li Cho at the National University of Taiwan, along many other outstanding colleagues, students, and researchers who are helping do our work. So what is it that we do? We look at how kids learn how to read. If you're listening to me in English, then you know something about learning how to read in English. We think that when children begin en route to learning how to read in their languages, they know the word and how the word sounds. You may know that the word cat is a furry creature with a tail and whiskers, likes milk and says meow. So you have an association between sound, cat, and the meaning of the animal. And now you're going to learn how to read this word, cat, C-A-T. If you're a reader of a different language, such as Russian, you may know that the C doesn't really work here. It would be a K. Therein begins the problem. In languages like English and many others, the sound to letter mapping is actually inconsistent. Why would it be a C and not a K? The way it says in kitten, it would be more phonologically principled. So now the children must learn the way that things sound and the way that they mean map onto orthography. And orthography is a good tool, but it's imperfect. So in a case of words like deprotonation, so non-word doesn't exist. Sound like something like might exist, but it's not. And for that, we think we need that sound to letter mapping principle where you're going to be able to read a long word that you do not know using sound to letter mapping principles. In mapping print onto meaning, we can consider such English words as there, and there. entirely different meanings, but similar sounds mapping onto different spellings. So in this case, there's a meaning to print association more so than a sound to print association. At the theoretical level, folks like Perfetti and Hart have put forth a theoretical perspective called lexical quality model, and it's about a word. We have a word. You have a word cat. The word cat has elements. It has sound, it has meaning, it has an orthographic form. The more you learn about sounds, meanings, and print, the richer will be your word representation. However, we note there are cross-linguistic differences in the way that this lexical quality or word representation works. If you had experienced a language such as a Romance language such as Spanish, you may know that gato is gato, you hear it, you spell it exactly as you do. Something different will happen in Chinese, where you're more likely to map a meaning onto print rather than sound onto print. These are well-established differences. The questions are, where do they come from? Roman script, right? Spanish, French, whatever it is, we call kitchen Latin, comes from Latin. Those Roman texts, Latinate texts, we can find them. They permeate the Western culture. At the same time, if you look to the East, you'll find completely different types of orthographies. When I give a talk in China and I ask them, would you like to switch to Roman alphabet? Would you like to switch to a Cyrillic alphabet? And people shake their heads. No, they really don't. Folks, we feel a cultural affinity to our scripts. They're part of our heritage. This is on the stones we find in the ground. It's in the text. It's in the books on the shelf. It's the things we've learned when we were young. We have a deep cultural affinity, familiarity, and a sense of comfort and affiliation, identity, if you like, with our orthographic forms. Can that be modified? Well, sure. If you're as old as I am, think 20 years back when the first cell phones had come out and they were all made the same and they just had the English alphabet, and all of us, whether we spoke Russian or Arabic or whatever else was your language, all of a sudden had to stuff some sound to letter mappings onto this English script and operate in it as best as we can. Thankfully, we don't have to do this today. Modern telephones have been adapted to the various scripts. But there was a period in time in history where we all did it. I'm not sure we enjoyed it, but we all did it. So it's possible. So you can't say it is not possible to translate Russian or Arabic or another bunch of scripts into this Latin format. We can do it. We're not going to, enjoy it. It's going to be a little clunky and painful, but it's possible. So what drives it? Therein is the question. What drives it? What drives some of the orthographic differences that we see? Is this about culture or is this about language? Where is this all coming from? So let's take a look at a very famous example. This is Coptic, right? This is Coptic. Coptic is the Egyptian language. These are hieroglyphs. You may have all seen it. These are hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are hieroglyphic. You map a meaning onto a picture, oftentimes a deictic picture. This is also Coptic, but now you have an alphabet that will allow you to do sound to letter mappings, highly abstract. So how do you go from one to the other? It was a change in culture, right? It was a change in culture, adoption of the Christian culture, needing to translate the Bible and various other Greek Roman texts for those who spoke and wanted to read in Coptic languages. So as the old religion and tradition were going away and the new religion and tradition were coming in, there needed to be a scriptural change. So this is a cultural force, if you will. Let's see if we can make an argument for language. Let's see. So BN, letters BN. What could you do with this if you know English? You can do lots of things with BN. You can do bun, bean, ban, boon, bine, bone, bane, bean, bony, beanie, right? There's lots and lots of things you can do with BN consonants if you wanted to use them to transcript words. In a Semitic language such as Hebrew, this would mean only one thing. It means ben, it means son, and in this case, it can also mean Ben in terms of a name. So that's my son's name, we call him Ben. So if you will encounter BN transcripted as it is in Hebrew, you wouldn't be confused. You'd know exactly what it is. You do not have the millions of options that an Indo-European language such as English presents you. And therein we think, well, there's got to be something between the language and the orthographies, because Hebrew and Arabic speakers are doing just fine without the phonetic diacritics that can be added and then removed once people become proficient, whereas Indo-European readers really need their vowels put in place in order to make sense out of things. Otherwise, you'll be staring at this B-N combination, wondering for a long time what this meant. So how do we test this? How do we test whether the culture or the language are the driving forces underlying our orthographic forms and what we use? We'll look through the bilingual lens. I invite you to look at the bilingual lens. If it's a cultural hypothesis, then there should really be no influence, right? There should be really no cross-linguistic influence, especially for such dramatically different languages as Chinese and English. Lots of children grow up in the United States, whereas their parents are immigrants from China and other countries. So if we're talking about culture, individuals who've gone to school in the United States really shouldn't be influenced by their parents' language and how they read. If we're talking about cross-linguistic hypothesis, then we have a chance. We have a chance. Remember, in the United States, most bilingual children will experience English-only education. Some lucky few will go to bilingual schools, but the vast majority will come out of the schooling system in the United States being dominant in reading in English, because we introduced them to English-only schooling as the primary approach. So in the case of the culture, this really wouldn't stand any chance. But if it's language, spoken language, even you can't read in Chinese, just the spoken language that you hear from your parents might make a difference. If orthography is about language rather than more so, or rather, right, in relation to culture. I don't want to undo the cultural argument. As we said, we identify with our orthographies, but which is the driver of how we read? So drivers of dual language representations, there are many and varied. And if we look at the adopted hierarchical model hypothesis by Judith Kroll, which typically applies to spoken language, but we can easily see it in an orthographic form as well. So in this case, you have a dominant language, L1. If you hear my Russian accent, that's my first language. I have learned to speak and to read and to write in Russian before I came to Canada at about the age of 20. So that's my dominant language. And the way I read, speak, and think in Russian ought to and does influence the way I speak, read, and process English. I am deeply alphabetic, phonetic, and so that would be my modum operandi, logical. However, for those who may have experienced those two languages early in life, we call them dual first language learners. Might be a bit of a different story, because you don't have an L1 and an L2 in a way you would have learned one and then another one at school and then a bit more intensely at the age of 20. You have the opportunity, the way the immigrant children do, is to experience both languages early in life during the sensitive periods of neural organization for language. And so language A and language B rather than language 1 and language 2 is what we have. And those might have some overlapping representations because the child was learning them as their brain was organized for their language system. And in fact, in this case, Hernandez and Bates had suggested there might be an element of interaction or possibly even amalgamation in a way that a child figures out sort of a third way of processing language in a way that suits best both languages rather than each language individually. Let's take a look at this from the neuroimaging perspective. If you were going to look at folks such as myself, you learn Russian formally and you know it and you speak it until the Soviet Union current drops down, you get out and you experience English. So we take a look at these folks who speak Chinese in China, and they're learning English as a second language at school. And so if we look at them, we can see that the way they process Chinese is distinctly different from the way that native English speakers would process English. So this is a comparison of the monolingual speakers in English and the monolingual speakers in Chinese, and we compare their L1s, if you will, the native English speakers, the native Chinese speakers. They don't look anything like each other. This is a study done by Fan Chao and James Booth, wonderful colleagues who do really great work, and this is what they show. Chinese doesn't look like English. You may have suspected that. Chinese doesn't look like English, and there it is. However, when we ask these Chinese-speaking individuals to process English, they're doing a phonological rhyme judgment task, if you're interested. So now they're doing this cat-hat type rhyming judgment task in English, and there's no difference. There should have been massive differences, right? Because when you do this in Chinese versus English, there are big differences. However, when you ask a Chinese speaker to do the same task in Chinese and in English, you don't have a difference, which means that a Chinese speaker has co-opted the mechanism that they've developed very early in life for processing Chinese, and now they're using those mechanisms for processing English. They're not developing a whole set of new systems to do it in the way that a monolingual English speaker does. So that's what happens when you've learned a language late in a school as a second language. But what happens to kids? The question that we ask is what happens to children? So in a situation where you are speaking English and you're speaking Chinese, you're reading English and you're reading Chinese from a very early point in life. And through the lens of these children, we aim to uncover the universal and language-specific elements in the processes and look for some elements of, as we discussed, amalgamation versus or transformation in the way they're processing language in compared to the monolingual kids, right? So we're going to use the bilingual lens to look at the orthographies, the universal and language specific, and we're also going to look at the way learning two languages modifies an individual so that we can gain better understanding into linguistic mechanisms driving the way we read in one language, different languages, two different languages. So learning to read. Learning to read. English versus Chinese. There are differences, as you've just seen neurologically. The way we process words in English and the way we process words in Chinese is not the same. The way we read them is not the same. This begins very early. Here are second graders. This is a cross-cultural comparison by Kemi McBride. She looked at children in Hong Kong who are learning how to read in Chinese and compared them to second graders in the United States on how they learn to read in English. So this is the triangle. Remember, we talked about meaning, sound, and word reading. So the cat meaning cat and the sound meaning sounding cat and the CAT, right? This is our triangle. I've laid it flat because that's how in a lot of the statistics we model things. Notice that at the level of meaning, we have two elements. What we have is morphological awareness and vocabulary. Most of you know what vocabulary means. That's right. The words like cat and they mean cat. Let's take a look at what morphology is, because that makes a difference as well, as you'll see in a moment. Morphology helps us make words, and this is different across languages somewhat. So there's a word desk, and if you were going to do it in Spanish, you'd get escritorial, right? You'd add some prefixes and suffixes, which means that this is a place to write. And in Chinese would be a compound word, book table. We have compound words in English as well. Apple tree, snowman. So those are compound words as opposed to derived morphology. We'll come back to this in a moment, but just so that you have an idea of what morphology is about. It's those prefixes and suffixes and multiple roots that help us make new words. This is very important for Chinese. This is non-trivial because when you think what the characters, Chinese characters map onto, they map onto meaning. So if you look at the word tree, I'm not going to try and pronounce it, not upset native Chinese speakers, but then you look at the word leaves, recognize the same character, they recognize the same phonetic form. Same thing for forest, recognize the same character and the same phonetic form. So in the same way you will think about pine tree or apple tree in English, right? You have that piece, and while we have it in Indo-European languages, this phenomenon is far more pervasive in Chinese. In fact, 95% or more of Chinese words are made this way. So these are the building blocks of spoken words in Chinese. Spoken words, and then it is logically translating into orthography such that you have characters that are now mapping onto these. right? So to read in Chinese, you really need to recognize those morphemes because that's what the characters are mapping on. Not surprisingly, then if you look at English versus Chinese, look at that. Phonological processes, sound to letter mappings, CATs, make cat, that predicts a lion's share of learning to read in second grade English speakers. We've known that for a while. If you compare this to the Chinese speakers, here it is. The variance is now split between vocabulary and morphological awareness, right? I've been preparing you for seeing this finding for some time. It's a meaning-driven orthography. These are the tasks that will predict literacy success and dyslexia in Chinese as compared to phonological tasks that will predict literacy success and dyslexia in English. So, question is there a cross-linguistic interaction between these two once kids begin to learn how to read? Remember, very different orthographies, and if culture plays a role, we really shouldn't be seeing much of a difference. If orthography has something to do with it, it should tell us something. So we'll look at Chinese speakers, we do look at Spanish speakers, we compare them to monolingual speakers, and we oversample for dyslexia so that we can answer such questions as, can you have a dyslexia in Chinese but not in English, because such different elements are playing role in word reading. Our kids go to English-only schools. The way is typical to the United States. Some of them attend after-school programs, and this is longitudinal as we fight through their online testings through this COVID period. So let me see. I'm not sure how the audio works, but this is a video of our laboratory once at the time when we were able to invite participants.
To study child language, we invite families to our laboratory at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Children complete tasks of language and cognitive development. They also play fun computer language games while we measure their brain activity using safe, child-friendly methods.
So that's our laboratory, and children do the behavioral assessments and the neuroimaging assessments, as we describe in this quick clip. So how do we measure morphology? Children hear words such as bedroom, and they decide in which word matches better, classroom or mushroom. Bedroom and classroom have a root to share, right? The word root, room, whereas mushroom is just a distractor here. Derived morphology, dancer, singer, finger, right? So the ER turns nouns into verbs, whereas in the case of finger, it's not a dancer and a singer, right? So it's a root by of itself. Phonological tasks, in this case, the children needed to decide which two words match in sound rather than meaning, right? So summer and slipper do. And again, there's a semantic distractor. In the previous case, we had phonological distractors, but now we have a semantic distractor, winter. But the children must ignore the semantic distractor and choose slipper because those are the two words that start with the same sound. So what's about the lexical quality in the bilingual kids? Let's take a look. Meaning, sound, word reading, how are these associations playing out? Here are monolingual kids. The variance is split. It's split quite nicely. So morphological awareness and phonological awareness make an equitable contribution to children's reading. And this is now a standard finding in the English language. This commensurate to the last decade of research. Let's look at the Chinese bilinguals. Here they are. So what you get here is a reorganization of this semantic triangle, if you will. So here the morphological awareness makes a direct contribution to reading, but there's no vocabulary contribution, and relatively little relation in morphology and vocabulary. In contrast, you can see this entire set of associations are rotated. Remember, English is not Chinese. We don't map sounds, we don't map characters onto meaning. Rather, we tend to map vocabulary items onto meanings, right? It's not entirely a morphological map. So there it is. There's a strong association with vocabulary and reading here. And in fact, if I zero in, there you go. So if I zero on vocabulary, which is the closest semantic match to reading in English, you do not really have an association between vocabulary and reading in monolingual English-speaking kids, right? It's absorbed by phonological awareness. But here you have it. There it is. It's powerful, it's robust, it's split in these two ways between vocabulary and phonological awareness. By the way, I'm not showing you Chinese data here. These are monolinguals reading English, and these are Chinese bilinguals reading English. You're not looking at any Chinese here, right? This is English. This is the way English is read by monolinguals, and this is the way English is read by Chinese bilinguals. By and large, these children are born to United States. They're born in an English-speaking country. They start daycares at an early age, and by the time we test them, they would have all started kindergarten in the United States. So these children are English dominant. They read in English as their primary language. In the state of Michigan, from which I'm speaking to you, kindergarten is mandatory, starting with age 5. These children are experiencing 4 hours, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., they're learning to read in English. That's their primary language. And they do so really well. I haven't shown you the accuracy bars, but they're identical. So if you looked at their accuracy, it's the same because their reading experiences are the same as those of monolingual kids. If you look under the hood, they're not doing this in the same way. They're not doing this in the same way in this shared language. And what others have said, well, if you read in Chinese, right now in this case, we really are comparing English to Chinese, what you should be seeing are differences, neurological differences between the way folks read in Chinese and English, such that English orthography is leaning heavily on the sound to print associations, whereas in Chinese, those 2 legs or 2 roots are just as strong. So it should be a 50-50 split. Again, this is for Chinese data, right? The idea is that for Chinese reader, when they look at the character, they're processing sound and meaning to an equitable strength compared to an English reader that's mostly more phonologically biased, or phonologically based rather. So somehow our English Chinese readers are doing the same thing in their English, which is their dominant language of reading. So there's got to be something about spoken language, right? But I'm leading you to the idea there's got to be something about spoken language experiences, because our Chinese bilinguals are very poor readers of Chinese. They're very good readers of English. They're poor readers of Chinese. They speak Chinese at home. They've been speaking it from birth. So what's about the spoken language that might be yielding these powerful transfer effects that make them look like Chinese readers in the way that they read? And folks had said that's got to do with that morphology. So because Chinese words are like apple trees and pine trees, they split up into these morphemic units. The words are splitting up in these morphemic units. So something about those morphemes, those morphemic units that are so meaningful, much more so than they are in English. We have all these all these morphemes that really don't stand alone and mean much in comparison to the way that Chinese operates. And so I said, well, there must be a tighter interconnection between sound and meaning at a morphological level for Chinese, which is what's driving some of these differences. And so here's another study by Jin Chao. And what he's showing is that if you look at a part of the brain such as insula, which in the previous research has shown to show differences in the way it processes sound and meaning, for an English speaker, you don't really have that difference for phonological versus semantic processes in Chinese, as an argument that at a neurological level, when looking at a morphological, and in this case, they did an auditory task. They're looking at the auditory task, and they're saying that even when you do auditory processing of the Chinese morphemic units, you're essentially engaging the same parts of the brain for sound, meaning, and print, and it's less dissociated in the way that it is in an alphabetic language such as English. So the more, right, so continuously supporting the idea there's more equitable distribution. So what I'm getting you to the idea here is that when a bilingual Chinese-English child sets on the task of learning how to read, their sound to meaning associations may be different than that of a monolingual English-speaking child, because Chinese gives you that tighter sound to meaning association, and they're transferring that into their English word representation, and then they're transferring that into how they ultimately read in English. We test this idea by comparing our bilingual kids. So this is a study that's been led by Kevo Zheng, and what she does, and I apologize, some of the graphics didn't work out the way I wanted. The way what we'll do look is that we'll look at the English morphology, right, task, the bedroom, classroom, mushroom, and what you see is neural activity that is left frontal gyrus, temporal lobe. So all those regions you think should be associated with recognizing morphemes or words. So these are parts of the brain known to be associated with sound and meaning processes. If we look at the phonology, what you see is more of a temporal activation, which we know is heavily associated with the sound to meanings mappings, phonological representation. So this is something that we've seen for English for a very long time. And this is standard. So if you compare morphology to phonology in English, you're going to see more frontal lobe activation for morphology. This is around broad 145. These are meaning, round sound to meaning mapping. Remember, morphology in English is relatively abstract. So you see these frontal activations. And if you look at this STG-MTG region, it's in blue because it's stronger for phonology. So for morphology, you get this frontal lobe, and for phonology, you get this temporal lobe. Again, this would be a standard finding for almost any Indo-European language in the way that morphemes and phonemes would work out. Let's look at Chinese, right? So just a reminder here. So we've got ventral eye of G for morphology, and we've got STG-MTG for phonology. Again, standard to English. It's been shown across multiple studies. Let's take a look at Chinese, right? So we're asking whether those associations, sound to meaning associations, are closer, somehow more overlapping. And we're doing this in the spoken language of these bilingual children. So here's morphology in Chinese. Here's this ventral eye of G, the same one as you see here. This notice is that STG-MTG region that we find stronger so in the phonology of English. There it is. Here it is in Chinese morphology, but here's the same region for English phonology. We don't find it for English phonology at all. In fact, we find this other sensory motor loop here, right? This is articulatory primary auditory cortex type. So different set of processes are kicking in. Again, the task is auditory. They're not reading it. They're hearing the words. So what I'm showing you is these auditory processes, which we believe underlie those differences in how kids learn how to read. So we partially confirmed the idea that there is indeed a tighter association between sound and meaning in Chinese word processing, because we see the same types of frontal activation for the two processes in Chinese. And so here there's no difference because it's the same. Here, 1, 2, there it is. What we do find is a completely reverse pattern of activity, for the temporal regions. What's up is down for Chinese. So that STG-MTG region, which is more active for phonology in English, right? This is the part of the brain typically found to be deactive or less active in English speakers with dyslexia, sort of a standard finding. The activation in this region goes up as you become a more proficient reader. It is less so if you have a dyslexia. This is a standard finding. Here it is. It's more active for phonological processing compared to semantic processing in English. And boom, you get a complete reverse once you look at Chinese. So when we talk about whether differences in orthography or culture drive our differences in learning how to read, there it is. Same process, reading, completely different pattern of activation. You get this region which has been universally acknowledged as the driver of the segmentation, but we typically think of phonological segmentation that allows us the sound to letter mappings. This, the same part of the brain that supports your morphophonological segmentation for Chinese. This is an important difference. And so the way that these things work out influence the bilingual reader. And you may have said, well, all of this is very interesting and it's just Chinese. Chinese really is out there compared to an Indo-European language. The distance is too big and maybe it really muddies things up. Well, okay, fine, let's look at Spanish, right? So we share an alphabet, we share lots of words with Spanish. In terms of English and Spanish, there's much greater extent of overlap. And so maybe in this case, we really wouldn't be finding those kinds of dramatic bilingual differences, and the way things operate would be quite different. Okay, just as a reminder, meaning, sound, word, right? The lexical quality triangle. There it is. There it is in the English language. And so what you're seeing, right? Remember, this is mostly a sound-driven path. For Chinese bilinguals, it's split 50-50. Excellent. What happened in Spanish? Well, the opposite had happened in Spanish. Look, this is not really a strong mechanism, But here it is, it's on the sound. So it's a mirror image, right? What I'm showing you is the mirror image of Chinese. Now there's a much stronger association between phonological processes and reading, and a stronger association between vocabulary and the sound process. This manuscript, if you wanted to read it, is now in press with Child Development. Shin Sun is the first author. She's done most of this work. So what she's also shown is that it's not random. These are indeed effects of direct transfer. So phonological awareness in Spanish makes a substantial contribution to children's phonological awareness in English. And there's this really powerful association between sound and meaning in Spanish, in English, right? And so there's a direct link, in fact, there it is. Spanish phonological awareness also makes a direct contribution to word reading in English. As you can see very nicely, Chinese phonological awareness also makes a direct contribution to word reading in English. So that's actually quite similar to Spanish, but the extent to which this transfer is almost half of that we see in between Spanish and English compared to the Chinese and English when you actually look at the two languages in relation to each other. So what we're showing you is that you have this very principal transfer effect. And what I've shown you for Chinese flips literally the other way around once you look at English. And remember, I am showing you data from children who, when they were 4, went to preschool in English and have been in these schooling systems from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., 5 days a week, learning to read in English, yet they don't look the same. They don't look like the monolinguals, and they don't look like each other, even though their proficiencies are relatively matched. And by looking at proficiency, you will know that these children speak different languages at home, but you look at the mechanisms and you see there's really powerful differences in how they do it. There's a lot of flexibility to the human mind. Now let's come back to the morphology for a second, right? Remember, in English and Spanish, we use a lot of derivational morphology, those abstract re, li, y units to make words. In Chinese, we use compounding. Does that make a difference? And the answer is yes, it does. For a monolingual speaker, both types of morphological processes make a robust contribution to their word reading in English. In the bilinguals, the one that makes the most contribution is the one that is not present or less present, not the all present, but just to a different degree, the one that's less so present in their home language. So in Spanish, it's mostly driven by the compounds, and the Chinese, they're driven by the derivation. So the stuff that's not transferred, that you don't share between the two languages, is the stuff that matters, because you need to learn it in your new language. That's the only place where you're learning it. Right, so this is evidence of transfer, if you will, because you've transferred what you do know, but now you really need to pick up what you don't have from the other language. And same thing, let's take a look at the neurological level. So if you look at the Chinese speakers compared to the monolingual speakers, again, we're just looking at English compounds. They're actually not that different once you compare the compounding processes in English and the Chinese. They look quite similar. Pardon me, they're in English. They're just Chinese speakers and monolingual speakers, and we compare the compounding for these two types of speakers of English. We don't see much of a difference. The difference is quite substantial at a neurological level for the derived. The Chinese speakers, when processing English, do a lot more frontal lobe activation, superior temporal gyrus. So this is basically the language network that's on when they're looking at derivational morphology in English, which is, again, derivational morphology is not something that's very common in Chinese, but it is very common in English. Again, there are no differences in proficiency. These individuals are matched for their proficiency. And then we look at the Spanish speakers. Again, not much of a difference between Spanish speakers and monolingual English speakers for compounds in English, and not much of a difference for derived, right? So these two languages are Indo-European languages. They have compounding, they have more of derived than compounding, and they actually share morphemes and roots, and we really don't see much of a difference in how they process those. So that's sort of commensurate with how I think about this. Again, I'm showing you these neurological differences for groups of children who are entirely matched on their reading proficiency. They're in English dominant schooling environments. They're sampled from the exact same schools, in fact. So different readers, different speakers, same proficiency, remarkable plasticity of the human mind in the way we organize languages. So I've shown you all of that based on the spoken language processes. So you might say, well, all these neurological differences for hearing doesn't really matter. Let me show you an example of why you might think it does before we finish up. There's a classic seminal study by Paolescu. They compared Italian speakers and English speakers, not bilingual, but monolingual processes. And lo and behold, English speakers, when they read non-words, which is a very phonologically driven task, reading task, when they read non-words in English, they show more frontal lobe trimapic sound to letter in English. It's a task. Whereas in Italian, they show more of an STG associated with the automated processes in reading. What about bilinguals? What would they do? So this was something that we did with Kaya Jasinska, which I believe had also presented with your group recently. So she's taken lead in analyzing and published this paper. So what she found is that when she looked at the English, I'm not going to show you any other languages here. When she looked at English pseudo-word reading in monolinguals who spoke English, Spanish bilinguals and French bilinguals. She had 3 populations. When you compare monolingual English speakers to Spanish bilinguals as they read pseudo-words in English, you get this classic frontal lobe activation for the monolingual English speakers, even though they're all reading in the one and the same language. So there we go, that transferred very nicely for the frontal lobe. And then in the opposite direction, Spanish speakers are actually showing more temporal lobe activation when reading non-words in English, not in Spanish, in English. They're showing this, they're doing this in a way that would be commensurate with Spanish representations. We get these temporal activations, and a similar pattern for French speakers. And French is somewhat in between, so we don't have these frontal differences for French speakers, but we have them for temporal, because French is not as transparent, phonologically transparent as Spanish, but not as deep as English is. So you have these principal differences in transfer for the spoken language, and then for the reading. What I'm arguing is that these reading differences are stemming from spoken language differences, and these spoken language differences in bilingual are stemming from the structure of their native language, because at the end of the day, orthography is not such a bad fit for linguistic structures that we have. So it's not just the cultural affinity that you have, but rather it is a match between the language that you speak and the language that you read in the way that we have come up with these systems. So what's universal? What's transferred? Time to make some inferences. We segment words into relevant units. What is a relevant unit might be different. If you are talking about Spanish and English, those are sounds, right? These really are sounds, morphophonemes, but we really are talking about phonemes. When you're going to do this in Chinese, again, morphophonemes, but now they're morpho more than phono. They are units of meaning that have sound in that regard. So it's universal that the same parts of the brain, such as STG and MTG, would do these processes. It's just that lock and key mechanism is, as we see it on the surface in performance, is somewhat different. And amazingly, children transfer this. So bilingual speakers who are born into households that speak a language different from English, even though they go on to speak and read English in a way with the same proficiency as a native speaker of English, do so differently. And they do so differently depending on the language they have heard at home when they were young. So if you've ever worked with bilingual immigrant families, the parents will inevitably complain how their children don't want to learn, and they don't know as much, or they make so many mistakes, how their English is so perfect compared to their Chinese or Spanish or Russian or whatever is the language. However, unbeknownst to them is their brain works differently. The brain of a child, even if they're born here to parents who speak a different language, works differently as they process English. That is the big discovery of the day that I'm sharing with you here today. Why so? Because experience with multiple languages transforms your word representation, the way you process the morphophonological aspects of your word. It's transformed, and it influences the way these children are learning to read or to map sounds and letters in print. So the reading brain through bilingual lens, there are multiple paths to literacy success in a given language, such as English. You can do it successfully, you can do it differently. There are very powerful transfer effects from the non-dominant language of reading. When we talk about transfer effects, we tend to think, oh, well, here you hear my Russian accent, right? Because that's my first language. It works the other way around just as powerfully. You can transfer from your dominant language of reading, in this case, English for these children, from your home language into English from the home language in which you really cannot read all that well. And we do this through these lexical representations. So to sum up, reading is complicated. It's about timing, environmental influences, the way you've learned how to read, the way your brain is organized. And the bilingual brain is doubly complicated. We're dealing with issues of multiculturalism, neural organization that differs. You have to have learned it twice. So multitude of factors come in between. And at that point, I thank you for your time, and I also thank members of my laboratory for their extraordinary help, and I welcome your questions. And I apologize if I've run over time that it added to how long it took me to come back here.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. So we are open for question. If you have a question, you can submit in the Q&A panel, or if you want to ask your question, just let me know to unmute you. While we are waiting, I have one question that I missed in your talk. What's the difference between, it's like very basic, I apologize, English derived and English versus compound?
So for the derived morphology, unlikely. So there's a like, there's an unlike, which is the root, and then li. So you have a prefix and you have a suffix. If I give you un all by itself, you have never seen un all by itself now, have you? Doesn't just fly around in a sentence. You haven't seen li all by itself either. These by themselves are not standalone. So derivational morphology is when these morphemes cannot stand alone by themselves. They have to be attached to something. There are rules. So ER turns nouns into verbs. Dance, dancer. If you wanted to, that's what we talk about them. They are the little tools from which we make new words. Compounds is you take a word and you take another word. Snowman, Catwoman, Batman, right? We make them all the time. iPhone, right? So we use this productively all the time. You take a word, take another word, you put them together.
So we have a, thank you very much. We have a question, a couple of questions from Mahnush. So the first question is one of language A and B always dominant? And does learning language B changes the quality of speaking or reading in language A?
The answer is yes and yes, but these are dynamic, if it makes you feel better about any of these. So in the case of immigrant children, what happens oftentimes is that around age 3, if you have a household that speaks Spanish or whatever else, or Farsi or whatever else is the home language of the day, the children may, even though they might be in the United States, will emerge as dominant in that heritage home language. But then they will enter school and this may flip. And usually in an English only context, by the time they're grades 3 and 4, they had finished flipping. They are now English dominant. That dominance is usually based on experience. So people tend to think, so when people think about little kids, we tend to think about sensitive period of exposure. The earlier, the better. What people forget is also easy come, easy go, is what happens when you're in those periods, is that the experience itself and the relative amount of each of these languages that you get at this point will make a difference. Perfectly balanced kids are a rare find. Even in perfectly balanced situations, such as you can go Montreal, Canada, where they speak French and English, a family naturally tends to make a pick. Either the folks prefer to speak French at home or they prefer to speak English at home. And so it is possible to be perfectly balanced. I'm not saying it's not possible. You really have to just find yourself in that perfectly balanced multilingual environment. But if you find yourself in a dominant situation, it's possible that next year over whatever was dominant this year is not the same as the year before. And so you will have these cross-linguistic influences and switches in the early periods of life because the brain is so plastic. But there's also evidence on older individuals that I'm not such an expert on.
Okay. And follow-up question is, until what age learning the second language make it language B rather than second language 2? So
Again, it is
age.
experience. It is experience. It is the extent and the intensity to which one has to operate. So I do add to this. So if we're talking about children, that's very easy, right? All you have to do is you put this child in an immersed schooling environment, and that's it, right? These children at grade 3 and 4 will come home, and they don't have an academic Spanish. They don't have an academic Chinese. They don't have an academic Arabic or Farsi, whatever it was in the house. They will be dominant in that other language in this domain, and adults find themselves in the same boat. Go do a PhD program, you know, not Max Planck in Germany. You will discover, or in France, and you will discover that you're switching. Your professional language is switching to the other language. Don't ask me to give my talk in Russian. I will stumble and fall.
So another interesting question is there any difference between learning multiple language at the same time than like learning 2 languages, like multiple language versus bilingual?
Everything's a degree, and everything is a degree, because let's go the other way around. How about just learning one language? Even if you learn one language, you might think of yourself as monolingual, and lots of times people do, but there are dialects of the same language. And the same people in the East will not speak the same way people speak in the West. The way people speak in the North will not be the same way people speak in the South. So our monolingual, I'm putting it in quotes because there's a lot of diversity within a singular language, right? So if you've gone, if you've seen My Fair Lady, right? The movie My Fair Lady, where the goal was to change this woman's pronunciation to a more standard upper crust English, right? So you can have English, and at the same time, you have so much spectrum on the English. So everything's on a spectrum. You might get this spectrum through experience with multiple languages, or you can get this really rich spectrum by having experience with just one language. I mean, read Charles Dickens, right? So you don't, I can give you American examples, but those are sort of the ones that are maybe more classic to folks. Charles Dickens, My Fair Lady, right? We have these examples where one part of England doesn't speak the same, and you really have to change the way you pronounce them if you wanted to.
Another language question regarding your finding between English monolanguage and Chinese bilanguage. You show differences. So the question is how those are different, with the mono language, the Chinese, the people who speak in one language in Chinese.
So what we find in comparison bilinguals to monolinguals and Chinese, so it goes in both directions. We are, invite me again in a year. We have a wonderful colleague in Taiwan who is now looking at the flip side of it. So they're collecting data where the children are monolingual Chinese in comparison to children who attend dual language Chinese English programs. And so whereas our comparisons are monolingual English, bilingual Spanish English to bilingual Chinese English, and so they've assembled. There's about 100 kids that they've tested, so we should be able to take a look at them soon. But by just doing a comparison, because the types of tasks we use here have been borrowed, obviously, in Chinese from our colleagues in the Asian countries, and when we look at the findings, we seem to find trends that the way that bilingual English Chinese children here in the United States process Chinese phonological tasks, phonological awareness tasks, they do it more efficiently than their peers in Chinese speaking countries. because now it's a transfer of English into Chinese, because English is so, you really have to segment your KATs, and in a way that Chinese doesn't put that kind of pressure this early on. And so they seem to be doing better on tasks of phonological processing compared to their age-matched peers in China. Even though they have lower vocabularies, they don't read as well, but they can segment words much better so.
Thank you.